The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hello, and welcome to the ALCTS webinar on assuring materials can be used by your community. I'm Erin Elsie, a member of the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee, and I'll be your host for today's webinar. Our presenter today is Jill Hurst-Wahl. Jill is an Associate Professor of Practice in the Syracuse University School of Information Studies and the Director of its MS in Library and Information Science program, which includes this program on school media. A former corporate librarian, Jill has always been an advocate for expanding the career opportunities for LIS graduates. She is a member of the USNY Technology Policies and Practices Council and the Onondaga County Public Library Board of Trustees. Her interests include copyright, the use of social media, and the future of the profession. Jill is currently redeveloping a graduate class on collection development and access for the Syracuse University MS-LIS program. As you can see, Jill brings much expertise to today's topic, and we are fortunate to have her with us. A few logistics for today's presentation. All attendees are muted to prevent background noise, and we do not have interactive chat capabilities. You may, however, comment on today's presentation using Twitter. The hashtag is ALCTSCE. We do not monitor the Twitter feed, so if you have questions for our presenters, please type them into the question box on your screen. We will have time for Q&A after the presentation. This webinar is being recorded, and you'll receive an email with links to the recording and presentation slides shortly after the presentation concludes. And now, here's Jill. There will be a slight delay as we change presenters, and her portion of the presentation will begin with a poll.
Good afternoon. Thank you for attending this webinar. You should see on the screen a poll. This is a poll to just get you thinking about making materials accessible to your community. Please take a moment and answer the poll question. If you're in a group, kind of survey very quickly the people in your group and ask them to provide an answer. And let me get there we go. So you should see the poll. I see some people answering. So the answers talk about trying to serve people who speak and read a language other than English, cannot read or handle printed materials, don't read at the same level as others that your library services, cannot travel to the library building, prefer a different format. So I'm going to give this just a brief second more. If you haven't responded, please respond. Looks like there might be one more person who needs to respond. Thank you. Thank you for that. So, so the question is, what different abilities are you thinking about? Do you need to be thinking about with your library community? And thinking about people who read or speak another language other than English. Everyone's thinking about that. Actually, I'm very impressed with the level of thoughtfulness in the replies. So you're really thinking about different types of materials and different abilities. So thank you for that. And if we can close the poll, I think that would be helpful. So this is me. I'm Jill Hurst-Wahl, and very interesting to note that I wrote that bio several months ago, and so I talked about developing a new class on collection development and access. Since then, I've actually launched a class, a graduate class on collection development and access, which got me thinking about this topic more deeply. The other thing that got me thinking about making materials accessible and thinking about our community is how we are thinking about our community, both at Syracuse University and in Syracuse, New York. And so thinking about multiple languages, different ways people want to access materials, those are all things, access materials, those are all things that we're thinking about and all things that you and your libraries are likely thinking about. Now, as we go through this webinar, I'd like for you to keep some notes for yourself. So if you have a pen and paper handy or just something to jot things down on, I think you'll find that helpful. If you have information that you want to share with other people, there's that questions box that we can see, and we'll be monitoring that and then sharing out some information that people are posting in there. So that's not just questions, that's just information that you want to share with the rest of us. And again, we'll compile that information together and share it. So in thinking about collection development and access, one of the things that I went back to is Raghunathan's laws of library science. And I've modified them, as you can see. Three of these, the first three, really have to do with accessibility. Library materials, no matter what they are indeed for use. They have to be able to be used by everyone, not just some people who come to the library or some people who access the library. And so we think about materials differently than we did decades ago. We're not just thinking about books in a specific format. We're thinking about materials that can be accessible to everybody. In today's webinar, I want to talk about two areas. And the first is going to be, what is the need? So what's the need in your community in terms of accessibility? And the second is the provision of materials. So let's start off with what is the need, and then we'll transition into talking about obtaining materials to satisfy that need. So what's the need? What's the need starts with who's in your community. So think about for a moment who's in your community. Whether you're an academic or public library, who are you serving? Can you maybe write down some notes about who you see who comes into the library? What groups of people do you see? What groups of people do you see in your community who don't use the library? And then what are their different abilities? What's their need for accessible content? So again, jot some notes. And if you want to share anything, you can share that in the questions box. Now, I start with the community very purposefully. Our need for accessibility in the United States is more than we think. But we have to think first about who's in our community. Who are we seeing? Who do we not see? I think that's a great starting place. And then we have to think more broadly about who is in our community and what are their needs. For me, in my community, there's people I see every day. And I can look at them, I can look at what they're doing, and I can gauge something about their needs for accessible formats. There's people I don't see every day in my community, but people I hear about. And through that hearing, I can gauge something about what their needs are in terms of accessible formats. And then there's getting at who's really in our communities, right? Who's really there and what are their needs? The July 2017 estimates of the U.S. Census note that we have 21%, this is nationwide, who speak a language other than English at home. And that is for people over the age of 5. 21%, so that's 1 in 5 people nationwide who speak a language other than English at home. That may be your community. You may be in a community where it's 1 in 5. You may be in a community where those numbers might actually be higher. These are people who speak English, a language other than English at home. That these are people who may want to speak a language other than English when they're outside of the home. This is the language they prefer. This is the language they actually understand. The census says we have almost 13% of people living in poverty. Their need for accessibility are going to be different than those who speak a language other than English. It might be their ability to get to the library. It might be something about the amount of schooling they've had, reading levels. It could be a variety of different things that would impact their accessibility needs. 12% nationwide did not graduate from high school, and this is for those over the age of 25. So what are their accessibility needs? Is it the reading level, or is it something else? And then finally on this slide, we have those who have disabilities, or as I like to think of, different abilities. According to 2010 American with Disabilities report, 18% of our population have some different ability. They may prefer audio, not print. They may need Braille. They may need large format, or they may have a different reading level. So your community contains these people. Are these people that you see in your library? Maybe, maybe not. Are these people that you see on the street every day? Maybe, maybe not. And so just thinking about who you see may not give you the best view of who's in your community and the best idea of the needs that you need to meet. So your community has some boundaries to it. It might be actually your service area is what bounds your community. Your community might be a town, a city, a campus, maybe a corporation. But as you think about your community and you think about who you're seeing and their needs, just a little bit of a step back to think, what are the boundaries of your community? And then who's within those boundaries? This may be something you've already thought of. And maybe you've already done a bit of this work. But I want to talk about it because I found that people don't always think in as much detail as they should about who's in their community. So who in your community would have information about demographics of your community? Who? If you want to just pop into the question area some ideas that come to mind, that would be helpful. I'm going to tell you who I think of, but you might think of someone else. So I think of the census. Every community is in the census. There's the American Community Survey, which is part of the census. The United Way. If your community is served by the United Way, that United Way agency has actually compiled information and can make it available. Some United Way agencies actually push that information out. I think there's others that don't push it out, but have it available if you ask for it. Your Chamber of Commerce, if you're a public library or really rely on the demographics of your community, for your library. Your Chamber of Commerce is pushing out demographic information to people who want to relocate to your area. And so can you go to the chamber and get what demographic information they have? Now, yes, it's going to be the census. Yes, it might be some of the United Way information, but it might be something else that they've compiled, or maybe something else that they've interpreted that will be useful to you. Depending on your library, if you serve an academic institution, then that academic institution also has census information, demographic information. And I can tell you, because I'm at an academic institution, that they have much more information than they make public. So finding that person on campus or in a K-12 environment who has that information can be very helpful to you. Who is on that campus? Not just students, but faculty and staff, or in that school. What are their needs? What are their different abilities that you as the library need to be servicing? Because you need to know that and need to think about your collection. And then finally, if you are in private industry, and I don't think any of you are, but human resources is a great place to go. Human resources is, again, going to have a lot more information than you are seeing, that they should be able to share with you in some sort of an aggregated format. They're probably not going to tell you specifically who, but they should be able to tell you something in aggregate. And that's actually the same for K-12 and academic institutions. Now, there's links to some of this at the end of the presentation, so you can see what's available. But some of this, as librarians, we can probably find easily online or talk to our community members and get input from them. And I want to give you an example, and that example is Salt Lake County, Utah. And this is information from the 2016 census. This is an extract from the census. So this is not everything that census page gives you. The census page gives percentages. I think it's interesting to look at actual numbers, and so that's that third column. These are things that kind of stand out to me when I think about collections and the needs of my community. So who's the population? Salt Lake County, Utah, which is not where I live, but it's an interesting population. I can see the total population. I can see the number of people under 18. That says something about the K-12 population. The people who are in school, K-12, and those who are on their way to school. Here, that's almost 30% of the population. So in Salt Lake County, they actually have a young population. Who's over 65? 10% of the population. What are their needs? We can assume, guess, based on the people we have seen getting older, that there's some particular things they're going to need in terms of collection and accessibility. The next demographic information is about race and country of origin. So these are of interest to me, not because it's about race and country of origin, but because it might hint at something about languages. So foreign-born persons in this county is 12%. I would want to know more about where do these people come from? And what languages do they speak? Do I need to service those languages? Do I need to make material accessible in those languages? Here you see languages other than English spoken at home, that's 20%. So besides people who are foreign born, there are more people who are actually speaking a different language at home. Very interesting. Again, what are those languages? People with a disability under the age of 65, what are their needs? And again, the last one I want to talk about is people in poverty. So they may have needs that you want to serve that will impact the material type. Also impact how they access materials. So if I look at this, I can see accessibility issues all down the screen that the library should be attuned to. I can see questions from this data that the library should be asking. And again, this is a sample, Salt Lake County. Perhaps none of us have ever been there or lived there, but you can start to think about the questions that you need to ask of your data for your library and where you need to dig in a little deeper. Besides statistical data, I think about talking with organizations that work with refugees and immigrants. Refugees and immigrants may not be the people who are coming into your library every day. Depends on where the library is located. Maybe some are coming in, maybe some are interacting with you, but they may not be telling you what their real needs are. Those organizations can tell you what the needs are and help you to understand how to meet those needs. You'd want to talk with schools or academic departments that are focused on children and adults with different abilities. What are the needs? If you're on an academic campus, do you have an Office of Disability Services? Can you talk with them about the needs that they're seeing that you may not be seeing in the library? And again, I mentioned human resources. If you're in a company, a government agency, some other type of organization, human resources should be able to tell you if there's people with different abilities and especially people with different language needs. Again, questions to consider, and you're going to find I am posing lots of questions in this presentation. Are who's in the community? What are their information needs? And how can the library help? So again, continually to think about who are you trying to serve? What are their needs? And how can you help? How can you help? Lots of data that you can obtain and analyze, but I also want to encourage you to actually look around. And my notes on this slide really boil down to two things: eyes up and swivel your head around. It's very easy these days to be sucked into our devices when we're out and about, but it's really educational to look around, to see who's around you, what are they doing, and how are they doing it. Listening to the languages being spoken around you, listening to the needs perhaps that people are voicing, and bringing that information back into the library as you think about the needs that you're trying to meet. So with all of that information in hand, consider these things. How many people are in your library's community? I asked that before, I'm asking it again as something to keep in mind. How many would benefit from different formats or languages? And we know that there's a variety of different formats. So what are those formats that they need? What are the languages that they need? Again, Braille, audio, whatever that might be in terms of formats, and whatever languages people are speaking in your community. Are there particular digital and physical formats? What are their other needs? Anything else that you've gathered that in terms of collections that should be addressed? And finally, what conclusions can you make? So lots of questions. Lots of questions that actually you're going to ask yourself over and over again as you learn more about your community. So let me stop for a second and talk about the Syracuse City community as an example. Here in the city of Syracuse, we actually do have a diverse population. We have a lot of refugees and immigrants who have come to Syracuse. We have students at Syracuse University who come from all over the world, and some who actually settle in the city. If I walk around the city of Syracuse, I can tell you that I don't see the broad diversity that the city actually has. I have to know which neighborhoods to go into, which schools to go into, in order to see that diversity. So just looking around isn't going to tell me enough, but looking at data and then asking more questions will. I can go to certain community groups and ask them for information because they see more immigrants, more diversity than I might see on a day-to-day basis. I know because of who I interact with in the city of Syracuse that there actually is a deaf community here. I know that there is a blind community in the city of Syracuse. But on a day-to-day basis, I may not see them. And I may not see them in the library. So knowing that they exist, talking to people who understand those communities and their needs, and then reaching out to figure out how to service them is critically important. And finally, in the city of Syracuse, I know that there's a deaf community that does not speak English. And so that's really interesting. Not only from a community perspective, from a library perspective. These are people who should be using the library, but they are deaf and they do not speak English. And so how can the library actually service their needs? What kind of materials does the library need to bring in to ensure that they're having their needs met? Something to consider as a tool is a community survey. This is a tool that I was introduced to many years ago. I've used it with students, and it's an easy tool to use. It has nothing to do with demographics and everything to do with talking with people. So what's a community survey? A community survey is a way of asking community members for input. It's a way of listening to the community. It is not statistical. It is not a survey where you ask everyone in the community the questions, but it's a way of getting out in the community, getting input from members of the community, trying to get input from the diverse population, and spending a lot of time listening to what they're saying, what they're not saying, and thinking about it from the library's point of view. It's real work. It's real work to go outside the library, wander the community, and ask people for their input. There are some people who won't want to give it. There are some people who will give you very short answers. And there are some people who will want to talk a long time. And that's what makes it time consuming, because you want to hear all the variety. You don't want to cut people off. You want them to talk and share and learn from them. And I want to point out that's not talking about what the library is already doing. This isn't you selling the community on what you're doing. This is you listening to the community. Now, if you think about doing a community survey, I just want to point back to the demographics for a moment. You know that you have a diverse community. So if you did a community survey, could you get into those diverse communities and ask the question? It might mean taking an interpreter with you. It might mean going to some place where you're not comfortable. But this is one additional way of getting their input. What kind of questions would you ask in a community survey if you're going to go out and just ask open-ended questions? Well, I have 5 questions posed here. You might ask others, or not even ask all 5. But in a community survey, you want to ask open-ended questions, and you want them to count for something. You really want to get good information back. So from a collections viewpoint, I might ask what that person's passionate about. That says nothing about accessibility, but it does tell me something about what I might need to add to my collections. So the person might be passionate about art. I could ask, what do you care about the most? Now, what they care about may be different than what they're passionate about. The person might be passionate about art, but they really care about literacy in their community. So what do they care about? And how does that impact my collections? You might ask them, how can the library support you in those things that you are passionate about or that you care about? They might talk about collections, they might talk about space, they may talk about educational opportunities, they may talk about lots of different things. Again, just listen. Some of that information may be useful to other parts of your library. So that information may be important to your collections. And then the highlighted text really gets at accessibility. What type of materials and what type of formats do you prefer? What do you prefer? You may have to prompt them because they'll think of the library perhaps as being just about books. But what do they really prefer? You might go back to their passions, go back to the things that they care about, and say, well, you said you're passionate about art. So what kind of materials do you like about art? What format do you want those materials in? Anything other than books? I describe myself as a non-book reading librarian. And I've had people look at me horrified when I say that. Because librarians should be, supposedly, book readers. But that's not my preferred format. I like the term non-book reading librarian because it shocks people. Yes, I actually do read books, but it's not my preferred format. And so if someone asks me these questions, I would want to feel safe in telling them my preferred formats. I would want them to prompt me perhaps a little bit because my default might be what I think they want to hear and not really what I want to say. And again, don't get your defenses up. Try to make that person at ease so they'll really tell you what they want to be telling you. I know that there's books written on doing community surveys, so feel free to go and find them. I did not put any in the reference section, but I know that there are people who speak on this and who have written on it. But actually, you now know enough to do a community survey. So do you want to do one? If yes, is there someone you need to get on board to make it happen? Do you need to talk to your administration? Maybe you need to reach out to someone who's a more official capacity in your community to get that person's buy-in. Do you need volunteers? This could be something where your library staff may not be the right group to go out and do this. Maybe you know that they would be too opinionated. Or maybe you just cannot spare the time to have library staff go out and do this. So are there volunteers in your community that you might be able to muster? The Scouts, for example, or some other group that would be willing to spend some time doing this. And you might think about how many surveys you'd want them to do, and then maybe ballpark by testing it out in the library, how long each survey might take. Is this 15 minutes per interviewee? And that would tell you how much volunteer time you need. I was at a conference back in 2012 where I was introduced to doing a community survey, and people in that session, that conference session that night, actually went out into the community and did these. We each did 2, and then came back the next day and shared our results. So you don't have to have people, each person do a lot of them. You could get many volunteers just to do a few, and then also have them help you compile the results. So all of that is about who's in your community and thinking broadly about who's in the community. Now, my passion about this, my passion around this is from being in the city of Syracuse and just recognizing the breadth of people in this community. And again, the people that we don't necessarily see in our public libraries. It's also from my program, my master's program in library and information science, and seeing the students that we've gotten over the last 5 years or so. Yes, we have had students who are visually impaired. Yes, we've had students interested in the program and I think attend the program who had hearing impairments, who were deaf or hard of hearing. So I've had to think about how to make material accessible to them. And then turn around and realize that our libraries may not be seeing these people in the library and may not be thinking about bringing them in as users and then what their needs really are. So we really, I think, need to think deeply about who. And then we need to think deeply about making materials available. How do we do that as a library? How do we do that as people involved in collection development? So when I think of accessible, I think of 2 different things. And the first is findable. Findable. We often have a narrow view of accessibility, but you know, it's that material, right? It's the material. But the material has to be findable. So can the library's integrated library system or online catalog be used by everyone, no matter that person's abilities? Can they actually use the library's catalog to find what they need? Can they use the library's catalog on their preferred devices? If someone is visually impaired, can they use the library's catalog on their preferred device? If someone's visually impaired, that likely means they're using an audio mode on their devices. How does the library catalog work on those devices? Is it confusing? Does it take too much time? Can you have someone show you how those devices work and how they work with your library catalog and then learn from that? If someone's not fluent in English, can they use your library's catalog? Does the catalog get automatically translated into other languages? Can they use the catalog to find what they need? And then the other part of accessibility means, is it usable? So think about containers and content. In collection development, in my class last fall, I really emphasized with students that there were these two things, and we tend to combine them together, but there's two things. What's that container? Is it a book? Is it an audio file? Is it a video file? Is it what? An ebook? It's a container. It doesn't matter what's in the container, but is that container usable by the community, by everyone in the community? And then is what's in the container usable by everyone who's in the community? So think of containers and content. Is the material available in the person's preferred format? And so in thinking about provision, there are some things that we need to remember. We can't have everything in our library. I wish we could, but we can't. So in thinking about accessibility, can we actually obtain things in through different methods for our community? Is it already in the collection in an accessible format? Can we get it through interlibrary loans? Can we do demand-driven acquisition? Can we have it translated on demand? That might be an option in some circumstances. Can we obtain materials through some regional service? Can we do these things? And does our community know that we can do that? So in your community, do people recognize that they can come to the library and the library can meet their needs by obtaining materials that the library doesn't already have in formats that people can use? So with all that, let's consider a few final sets of questions. Is your website American with Disabilities Act compliant? Is it ADA compliant? If you're at an academic institution, I can tell you that the US government has been looking at academic institution websites and whether or not they're compliant. If you're in a public library or public library consortia, maybe the eyes of the law haven't shifted to you yet, but it's something you should be thinking about. Is your website compliant? Can people with different abilities use it? That's especially important if people are trying to use your website at a distance in order to find materials. What about your integrated library system, your online catalog? Does it meet the needs of your community members? Is it compliant? If it's not compliant, does your vendor have some way of making it compliant? And does your vendor have a way of making that system useful to people who don't speak English? Is there a plugin that you can license from them, or that they'll just give you outright? And always think of what it might take when you deal with an outside vendor in terms of time and funding. Now, if they're going to charge you, if they have something they need to give you, a plug-in, whatever it might be, how much time is that going to take, and what's the cost? I would also say that as you think about that last slide in terms of usability, whether it's interlibrary loans, demand-driven acquisitions, there's a cost to some of those things, a cost of time, a cost in actual funding, and that's something to keep in mind. You may want to, once you understand your community, start allocating funds so that you can meet their needs, whether it's demand-driven acquisitions or something else, but that you have the funds available to do that work. In addition, what processes do you need to have to ensure that community members can ask for and receive materials in alternate formats? When I think about who will handle the requests, one thing I think about are, does that person or persons or group have the necessary language skills or communication skills to be able to take in those requests? Do you need staff that speaks a different language? Do you need staff who are patient? Do you need staff who understand how to deal with people with different abilities and who can do that work without judgment? And if you don't have staff, then can you get staff trained? Or do you need to hire staff that can help in this area? Are there perhaps tools that they can use that will help them in this work, whether it's Google Translate or something else? Many, many years ago, the post office in Rochester, New York, had someone who worked there who was deaf, and he was an awesome person. One of the things that they had that helped him do his work was a mat in front of him that faced the customer, that allowed the customer to point at what they needed. Because when you go to the post office, you have a limited number of requests. And that facilitated the transaction and the conversation. So when you think about your communities, are there those kind of cheat sheets that you need to help your staff interacting with that community? Do you need additional funding? And again, who might you partner with on this? So I'm going to stop for a moment. This is my question slide, but I want to summarize a bit. I also want to show you the resources slide before we answer questions. If you have questions, you have comments, please pop them in the question box so that we can facilitate a conversation or at least some answers. So I want to go back just kind of verbally to the beginning. This presentation, this webinar has been entitled Assuring Materials Can Be Used by Your Community. And I've spent time talking about figuring out who is in your community. Who are they? And then spending time talking about provisioning those materials. Now, I've asked you a lot of questions, a lot of things for you to consider. I can't give you the answers. You actually need to go and figure out who's in your community. And that's work that will take time. Some of it you can do quickly. Some of it might take a bit more time. And if you're going to do a community survey, that's something you need to plan and then do. Provisioning materials. That's something we think about all the time, but you may need to think about more broadly based on who is actually in your community, not just the people who come into your library. And you may need to work to understand the budget implications of that provisioning activity. Setting money aside to ensure that you can meet the needs of your actual community. So with that kind of summary, what questions do you have? And by the way, when you get the slides, here are the resources on the slides. You can click on them. I think in the PDF, they will still be clickable. Or you can type these titles into your internet search engine, and you should be able to find the exact right thing. So questions, comments, concerns, disagreements.
Great, thanks, Jill. That was really an amazing session. As Jill said, you can go ahead and answer your questions in the question box, or she encouraged throughout, if you just have any comments or your side of the story to tell about this, we're happy to take those and discuss them as well. While we're waiting for questions to roll in, I have one for you, Jill. I'm wondering how you would go about this situation. In my institution right now, our website is not ADA compliant, and we're aware of that. But then we also have a major university-wide imposed website overhaul that's aimed for the library, but not until the beginning of 2019. So would you have any suggestions on what we should do in the interim? Because should we put all of our efforts into redesigning our site to be ADA compliant only to have it be completely redone a few months later?
I'm thinking. This is something we're going through here on campus, where our university is going through our website sites and prompting us to make updates to make them ADA compliant. And we know that there's this roll-through process where some sites are being targeted first and other sites are being targeted later. And in fact, some sites, some rarely used sites, may never be targeted. Mm-hmm. For the library, one of the things to think about is just some basic stuff. And it may be things that you can do now. So first of all, do you know which pages are most used? That's a question. And then on those pages, can you do some basic things in terms of headers to make sure the headers are compliant? That helps with screen readers. Can you ensure that any images on those pages are compliant, that they have the right tags so a screen reader understands what to do with them? And then can you just look at the other formatting and see if there's any tweaks that you can do now on those pages? There are tools that you can use, free tools on the internet that will look at your website and tell you the errors that are there on the site or on a particular page. And so that might be something to do, and then see if you can just pick off some of those errors and correct them. The other thing to think about, and so I'm moving from websites just to other stuff, is that you probably have other stuff on your website that is not ADA compliant. So PDF files, maybe PowerPoint presentations or other documents. And so if those are heavily used, taking time to use the right tools to ensure that they are ADA compliant. Microsoft, in their software actually has a option we can check for compliance. And I've done that on my slides. I'm doing that now as I create presentations. I actually go through, use that tool to check on accessibility. And what it's telling me is if someone were using a screen reader, for example, what order that slide would be read in. Or if someone is using a screen reader, will they understand what the images are? And so making those documents compliant could be work that you could be doing now. Sorry, that was a really long answer.
No, thank you. That it gives me somewhere to begin, and I feel much better about it. Thank you.
Sure.
All right, we have another question. So someone has a streaming video package from a major vendor, and they've discovered that a large percentage of the titles are not closed captioned. Do you have any ideas how to put pressure on the vendor to caption the film so that the whole collection is compliant?
So I would do two things. I'm not sure that either will work. So I think you might also, if you do these two things, come at it with some attitude. One would be to use statistics about your demographics, your community, and the people who cannot use the materials. So that could be helpful. You know, you, dear vendor, have these wonderful materials, but look at the people who can't use them because they're not captioned. So that's one way of going at it. The other is to kind of raise the flag of the American with Disabilities Act and say, you know, the U.S. government has said we should try to make things compliant, accessible. What are you doing towards that? Ask the question of them and then point to the amount of materials that aren't accessible. So again, just trying to put some pressure on them. They may be of the mindset that they will do it going forward, but they don't want to do their older materials because of the cost. And so depending what those materials are that aren't compliant, aren't captioned, maybe you want to say to them, great, we will only license the materials that are captioned. We don't want to license materials that aren't captioned.
Okay,
so
great.
Those are the things that come to my mind.
Okay, yeah, that sounds like a great answer and idea. So that is all the time that we have for this session. So thank you everyone for being with us today. And you should soon receive a short online evaluation form. If you could please take a few minutes to respond to those questions. Your comments are very valuable and will help the ALCTS Continuing Education Committee plan future events. The email will also include links to today's slide and recording. You now also have the opportunity to receive a certificate of attendance, and that information will also be included in the email. So I'd like to thank you again very much to our presenter, Jill Hurst-Wahl. That was such a fabulous session, and I think we all learned a lot. And thank you also to members of the Continuing Education Committee, Mary Rader, Joseph Nicholson, and Jaslee Coley from the ALCTS office. The support they provide make it possible to present these webinars. And ALCTS has other continuing education events coming up. Our next webinar will be on February 21st with a session on cutter numbers and shelf listing. So if you could please see the ALCTS website to register or find more information on these. And we also offer web courses, which are 4 to 6 weeks long, and we have 2-day email discussions. Check the website for more information on upcoming courses and discussions. So thank you again, everyone, for joining us today, and this will conclude our session.